All right. Hello, everyone. I am Alex, and I'm going to talk about making your Rails specifications a lot faster. Basically, talking about techniques to isolate things so that you're not doing more than you need to do. So first, I want to talk about why Rails specs tend to be slow. The main reason is this line that is in almost every spec helper out there that says load all of Rails. And so loading Rails is an expensive proposition. So when you do that before you run every single test or test file or whatever you're doing, it has an expense to it that you don't need to incur or you shouldn't need to incur. So I'm going to talk about how to avoid doing that. So the first step is figuring out what the various parts of your app actually need. Because the whole point is to never load up more than you actually need in order to test to make sure things work. Models need ActiveRecord if you're using that, or if you're using another ORM, they're going to need that. Decorators need Draper or a similar gem. Services and other things, maybe just pure Ruby classes and don't need much at all. And so those are the best things. So the more of those you can have, the easier life is going to be. So here's a very basic spec helper. So this is going to kind of set you up to be able to do a very minimal amount of stuff, but still run your code. So we set our environment, which shouldn't matter for most things, but just in case, we set it to test. And we actually require in the part of Rails active support dependencies, which handles the auto loading of your classes. So we're going to get into specifically telling it which ones to load in a minute, but that's a very small part of Rails and the only part we really need to pull in. And we don't need to, but it makes life a little easier. And then we've just got some RSpec configuration, which you can play with as it best suits you. But you'll notice it doesn't pull in it doesn't pull in Rails, it doesn't pull in Capybara, it doesn't pull in Factory Girl, it doesn't pull in all these other things that you typically are shoving into your spec helper. And then I've got something that I call a light spec helper. And you can call it whatever you want. The idea here is you require that initial base spec helper, so you get all that stuff on the previous slide, and then you augment a little bit with what you need. So in order to, say, run some tests on some services that you've created that are pure Ruby objects that don't really need anything else in the system, all you have to really do is make sure that your specs know how to find those things. So that's where the active support dependencies autoloader comes in. So you can just tack onto the autoload paths how to get to those files. So here I have an example of, I've got a directory of actions and a directory of services, both of which just have Ruby in them, and I'm just going to add those right in there. And I also include all of the files that are in a directory called Spec Support Light. So that way, if there's any support files that are common across my specs in this category, I'll stick them in there. Here's an example of one that's a little bit expanded out for decorators. So if you use Draper, then the idea is very similar, only we're also requiring Draper. And Draper has a cool thing that you can set this view context test strategy fast. And it basically means that it doesn't need a lot of the Rails baggage in order to do its job. And so that's one of the reasons why if you're using decorators, I recommend Draper. It's got it so that you can actually perform tests against your decorators without having a whole lot of extra around. This is all you need in order to test a decorator. Your models are a little bit more. I've been touching it.
Yeah, that wasn't fair.
That was totally
I literally just decided no.
Yeah. All right. Let's try this again. Okay. No. It hates me.
Jack, are you going to bed adapter?
All right. So your model spec helper gets a little bit more involved because in order, especially if you're using ActiveRecord. So ActiveRecord, in order for it to work, it kind of needs a database around, and so you want to create a connection. So you can still use your database YAML to tell it how to connect to the database. You just basically manually establish a connection for ActiveRecord. And then again, we include ActiveRecord itself, and in case we want to use any of the RSpec helpers, there's some specific things we can include in from RSpec, and then I like to use the shoulda gem, so I require that as well.
Shoulda doesn't include the RSpec ActiveRecord?
It may, but I was just being explicit. So it may very well include that. But this will give you enough to test your models. Now, this gives you a database connection, but I would highly recommend that you actually not utilize it if you can avoid it. So you can perform almost all of your model tests without actually persisting anything into the database. So definitely strive towards that. There are a few cases where you need to. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is if you have a validation on uniqueness, you need to create a database object in the database first to make sure that the uniqueness works. So, and then there's no factory girl here, there's no database cleaner. Again, because you shouldn't be actually creating a lot of stuff, you don't need any of that. Then you have your feature spec helper, and this is going to look a lot more like the normal spec helper you probably have in your Rails app. Again, we include that base spec helper, but now we're pulling in a bunch of stuff. Now we pull in all of Rails. We pull in Capybara, and I chose to use Poltergeist for our JavaScript engine there. And we've got Factory Girl and Database Cleaner, and setting up the strategy. Because we know we're only using this for feature specs, you can actually make this a lot simpler than you typically would have to, because you can just set your strategy to truncation, and you can just do some basic setup here, and then it's ready to go, and it's designed specifically for running feature tests. And these are going to be the slowest tests in your system that are going to do everything. So in order for all of this to work, you actually have to write code that is conducive to this isolation of your code. So the easiest way to do that is to write solid code, which I'm not going to go into heavily in this presentation because that's not what it's about. And if you want a presentation on that, I'm sure that someone, myself, or a number of other people can give a presentation on that. So just ask for that and we'll give one. But just so you know what it is, if you haven't seen it before, it just stands for 5 principles that you should apply when building your code. And the one that really matters in this case is the last one, which is the dependency inversion principle, and dependency injection is a form of that. So I just wanted to point out that when you're doing this, there's ways to do it safely so that what I just described as far as your spec helpers will actually work, so that your system can work nicely. So I have an example of some isolation-safe dependency injection here. So the idea is if you have a service and you need to inject in a factory here, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can send it in an initializer in some dependencies, or you can use a setter to set it in inside of your test. In both cases, you want to set up some kind of default though. And the problem is you don't want to talk about your default in a way that's going to make Rails complain that it doesn't know about such a thing. So in this example, I've got a service, and this service is an isolated piece of code, and the test for it is an isolated piece of code, and it doesn't know anything about this thing called a widget. And so to keep it safe, if you use the initializer with a dependencies hash, the best way to do it here is to use the block form of fetch on the hash. And that won't get evaluated by Ruby until it actually needs it. So in your tests, if you're actually sending that in and injecting that, then it won't ever run the block and see that it needs to know about a thing called a widget. You can also set up a writer and a read method, and if you set it before you use it in your tests, then again, because we're using an or equals in the accessor method, Ruby will never see that it actually needs to know that such a thing called a widget exists. So that's how you can deal with the fact that your code needs to know about other things in the system without actually having to see them in the time that you're running your tests. So you can also set up guard. Just because you're doing this doesn't mean you can't use guard. This is a big mess. I'm not expecting you to actually understand what's all here. But the point is, rather than just telling guard to watch everything and to just run everything, you kind of narrow it down what it's actually watching. And you want to tell it that if it's not told anything and you like say hit enter in guard and run everything, you want to specify that it doesn't actually run everything. So that's that spec paths there, where it's I'm being very specific as to what paths I'm actually watching. So if you hit enter, it'll run all of the tests that are actually more unit style tests and not actually your features. You want to run your features separately, usually on the command line. Just run them whenever you want to check to see where you're at as far as meeting your features and getting them to pass. Typically your workflow will be write a feature, it's going to fail, put it aside until you can write enough of the back-end code that's done through unit testing in order to make that feature spec pass. So does it work? Is it worth doing all of this? So I just grabbed a sample spec. It had like 4 tests in it just to kind of show what could happen here. But when I ran with a normal spec helper, the clock time was almost 4 seconds, and the RSpec reported time, which RSpec likes to kind of lie to you about how long things take. RSpec says how long it took to actually execute your tests, which has nothing to do with how long it took to spin everything up. And so that's why it's important to look at both the real clock time and the RSpec time. But the RSpec time was almost 0.2 seconds. However, when we ran it with the light spec helper, the real clock time drops to ½ a second, and our RSpec time is super hyper fractionally low at 0.005 seconds.
So basically over 8 times faster.
Yeah, so you save, and this was on just one spec file with 4 tests in it, and you're going to notice the speed increase drastically, especially if you're constantly running your tests with, say, guard. I'm sure a lot of you who have used guard have seen it constantly trying to keep up with you as you're trying to work, as it's running your tests and it's taking forever, and they go much faster now. You get that immediate feedback. And even if you're not using guard, just running it on the command line, you're going to get feedback a lot quicker. So what's the easiest way to do this? There's a cool new gem that has some generators in it. And it's called, it was built yesterday. It's called Rails Spec Harness. And basically you can, in any Rails project, you can say Rails generate spec harness, and it will do several things for you, and it's got several options on it in case you don't want it to do everything that it does. It's got some semi-okay docs around it, but it will enhance your gem file with a bunch of gems if you don't already have them. It will set up these various spec helpers And it's designed that each area of your app actually gets its own spec helper. So you'll have a model spec helper and a services spec helper, etc. And so whenever you're writing a spec, you just need to include the appropriate spec helper, and it will pull everything that you need just for those specs in there. And it works pretty well. And I finished way early, but are there any questions? Sorry, I went faster than I thought it was going.
Does your cool new fancy gem handle Mongoid?
It does not. It's ActiveRecord focused right now. But it's basically just a bunch of generators, so there's no reason why it can't be enhanced with a couple more options and generate a model's spec helper that knows about Mongoid.
The nice thing is you could run the current generator and then go into the model's spec helper and swap out the ActiveRecord pieces for the Mongoid pieces of that piece of
Yeah.
it would be the same. It would give you the
Yeah.
exact same.
It doesn't do anything other than generate stuff. It's just a set of generators for Rails so that you can Rails generate a few extra things. So you can use it as a base and then modify it as you see fit.
I noticed you're calling ActiveRecord.establish connection
Yeah.
to connect to the database, and you had to write your own code for doing that.
Yeah.
Why is that? Did you try to use the built-in Rails code that connects to the database?
Well, I don't, in that spec helper, I don't have Rails. Okay. So all I have is ActiveRecord.
Oh, okay. And
So
ActiveRecord doesn't know about database.yaml?
And ActiveRecord doesn't know about database.yaml. ActiveRecord doesn't know about anything. It knows how to establish a connection.
Yeah.
And you can do it a couple different ways. You can actually say establish connection and give it like the URL to your database, or you can say establish connection
With the YAML structure.
and pull the YAML out. But ActiveRecord itself doesn't know anything about database.yaml. So because we don't know about Rails at the model level, we can't do that.
Okay.
We didn't have to do that in the features spec helper because we are pulling all of Rails in. So Rails will handle creating that database connection for us, and we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, it takes a little bit of getting your mind thinking about things a little bit differently about not pulling in more than you need to pull in, which ultimately will allow you to make some better code as well, because the fewer dependencies your code actually has, the better code it's probably going to be. It's going to kind of almost force you to write better structured code, better architected code, because it's not reaching out and touching everything else that's out there.
Oh, it's also not assuming that there's an entire world around it that's going to reach into it and touch it
Right.
whenever it's accessed. Really bad enforcement. I move away from those really quickly. Yeah, what I would say is, so Alex and I have been tossing the idea of this back and forth for probably the last 30 months, sitting in our office. A lot of it grew out of the fact that I was working on a project where I was being slowed down in the work that I was doing because the tests kept loading on Rails. And one morning I was just like, I can't take this anymore. And I spent like 2 hours and sort of wrested control of the application away from Rails so that I could get back to a productive speed of building and stuff. That's actually where the second trick of doing the dependency injection example came from, because I need to use that for some of the classes that I was building.
Yeah, both of those methods came from Brian.
Yeah,
I fully admit I stole them both from him, so that I couldn't figure out how to appropriately decouple things, and Brian pointed out why I was being retarded.
Well, it's one of those things where unless you've either watched and or read way too many blog posts, which is pretty much my situation, or for some reason you read deep into the bowels of the documentation around how hash works. You don't recognize that fetch, that hash.fetch has the block format and what the block format does. Because it's kind of tucked away unless you're looking for it. You don't really realize what it's there for. We lost the picture.
Oh, we lost it a while ago.
Yeah.
So you didn't need to see the questions
No.
slide. There wasn't anything past that. So I wasn't worried about reconnecting.
Cool.
All right.